Show on 93.1 Jack FM.
And we're live at the Broadway, downtown Columbia. Tom Bradley, Carrie Edwards, and we welcome to the microphone Jennifer Bukowsky. Good morning. How are you?
I'm good, Tom. Thanks for having me on.
This is, I know you've done a lot of radio. This may be one of the first times you've done it with these headsets on. Just take that mic and bring it a little closer to your mouth over there, and then we're going to be absolutely okay. Thank you so much for being able to make it in to the show with, not a whole lot of notice. We communicated a few days ago, and then last night said, let's make this happen tomorrow. So thank you for coming in. I appreciate it.
No problem. My pleasure to be here.
The case that I wanted you to come in and chat about with us at length is this case with Kelli Smith. Do you want to go through and describe what happened? This goes back almost 3 years ago when the accident happened on I-70. Do you want to set it up for us?
Sure. It's been one of the most challenging cases of my entire career. On February 25th of 2012, Kelli Smith was 22 years old. She worked full-time for the Columbia Tribune, and she lived nearest. Are you familiar with the mile markers on I-70? I'm sure you are.
What do we have over here at the CF? Is that like the 124?
Yeah, so she lived closest to the 127 mile marker.
Okay.
And then at 3:30 in the morning.
Which is east of Columbia.
It's in the midst of Columbia.
In the midst. Okay,
yeah.
I'm sorry.
And then at 3:30 in the morning, without any reason to be there or any explanation, she's last seen in Columbia. She's 50 miles east of there, spotted 50 miles east of there, going the wrong way on I-70 in the passing lane, the wrong way within a lane, like it's a driving lane.
Mm-hmm.
She ultimately ends up in a head-on collision, which causes the death of another person. She's seriously injured. She's life-flighted to the University Hospital here in Columbia, and she's wearing no pants, no underpants. She doesn't have her purse or her phone.
That's the way that she was in the vehicle?
In the vehicle. She's alone in the vehicle. No purse can be found, no phone ever found. She's naked from the waist down, and she had injuries that indicated that before the accident, she'd been held down by her wrists, her legs had been pried apart, and she'd been vigorously penetrated in her vagina.
Oh my gosh.
With injuries to her cervix. So these injuries were so inconsistent with that of a car accident that the trauma nurses performed, and the doctor ordered them to perform a rape kit on my client to document the evidence of the sexual assault.
So, and I don't want to brush past the point that this head-on collision, it took the life of a man in his 30s.
It did, yes.
Who left behind a family, obviously devastated on this whole thing.
It's a really tragic trail of events, and it's filled with holes, which is the frustrating part of it, because Kelli Smith has no memory of much of the night before the accident, especially the few crucial hours leading up to the accident. So can you imagine, have no memory whatsoever due to being drugged and or a head injury of these few crucial hours of your life that change your whole life? So we've been trying to piece together, using phone records, using witness interviews, try to find out what happened to Kelli Smith that night, leading her to be 50 miles east of where she had any reason to be, driving the wrong way.
What you're really getting at is if she was raped, and you believe that she was, and if there was a rape drug involved, in which now we're talking about a whole different crime that has nothing to do with it, specifically at the time, an accident 50 miles away from here. We're talking about a whole other crime.
Yeah, the crime would have likely, we don't know where this rape would have occurred. I have my speculations as to where it would have occurred, but no investigation was done really to determine where the rape occurred, who committed the rape. The nurses did preserve a swab from her cervix for evidence and photographed all of her injuries. Unfortunately, they did not test that for male DNA.
Where's the swab now?
It's at the Highway Patrol.
And it was never brought into the case? It was not allowed?
The judge refused my request to get it tested for male DNA, so we'll be pursuing other remedies to try to get that tested.
So what it really comes down to is that the court system believes that she was intoxicated, drove the wrong way on the highway, had a head-on collision that was her fault, killed someone, charged her with
involuntary manslaughter in the first degree.
And she was found guilty in December.
Yes.
Formal sentencing took place last week.
That's correct.
You are or have filed an appeal.
We filed the notice to appeal. The trial was unfair for a whole host of reasons. And I don't know if you want me to get into the trial or if you want me to get into the state's blood alcohol evidence.
Oh, we want to talk about that as well, because there's pieces of this thing when I started reading it over the last week. And I was aware of the accident beforehand, but I wasn't aware of some of these other parts of your case. And I started reading into it, and I was like, what the hell is going on with this thing?
It's an endlessly fascinating case. It's brutally ironic that we have all these scars on the road and all the way down my client's leg. We have all of this evidence that this crash occurred and this incident took place, but we have so many holes in figuring out the sequence of events leading up to that crash that night.
How long did you have to prepare for the court case? A year?
Less than that. I was brought in to second chair it when it was determined it wouldn't go to trial, and then I ended up first chairing it shortly before the trial. So I just got involved with it last summer in limited capacity, and then took it on in full shortly before the trial.
All right, so we have in the Columbia area someone around college age. They're old enough to be drinking. The idea that in our area someone who's in their early 20s gets drunk and drives on the highway going the wrong way is not unheard of.
Yes, but there were probably over half a dozen retired law enforcement officers, maybe 10, and I asked each one of them how many times, and any times you've responded to an accident, this is firefighters, EMS, and police, or pulled someone over, how many times have you found a female alone in a vehicle, naked from the waist down? And they all had the same answer. This is it. This is the only case they've ever seen of that.
Wow.
It doesn't add up. It doesn't add up. I had her neuropsychologist say that her behavior that night, for her to be so impaired by alcohol that she would be able to drive 50 miles on Highway 70 somehow or another and not go off the road and crash, that's inconsistent with alcohol impairment alone. And I had a doctor, Dr. Valentine, who is an expert in toxicology, who testified that fermentation could account for 100% of that 0.085.
Well, and we want to get into this thing and talk about this blood fermentation, which I guess I've never really paid much attention to before, because I never thought that someone would take a sample of someone's blood and leave it laying around somewhere.
Yes, it was left unrefrigerated for 10 days.
So before we leave it unrefrigerated, they took her blood sample after the accident, after she was live flighted back to Columbia. They took it how many hours after the accident?
7.5.
What does that mean? If she was intoxicated, her blood alcohol content would have been getting reduced during that time, wouldn't it have not?
Yes, it would have been under normal circumstances that have been tested among healthy adults in laboratories. But when you're going through the kind of trauma that my client sustained, when you're going through a coma and numerous medical procedures, the way that your body processes alcohol is completely different. So you can't rely on any kind of retrograde extrapolation formulas, which are not really accepted science among experts anyway. But in a circumstance like this, where there's trauma that will greatly influence the formula, so you really, all you could do is guess at what her BAC would have been under ordinary circumstances. But you couple that with her elevated glucose levels in her blood. This is really scientific and technical, and but the glucose, you're a fan of beer, I know. You add sugar to a yeast to ferment and get beer. Well, there is yeast in a female's vagina, and if you have trauma to that area, it can get in your blood. Your yeast, your natural occurring yeast, can get in there. And then if you leave it unrefrigerated for 10 days, it's going to ferment and increase that level of alcohol in your blood.
Jennifer Bukowsky is the lead defense attorney for Kelli Smith, who was sentenced last week to 5 years in prison in voluntary manslaughter. You're listening to the Tom Bradley Show and to 93.1 Jack FM. Now, on this fermentation of blood, Jennifer, so is it more likely that could happen with a woman than a man? I mean, yeast naturally occurs in the air also.
Yes.
So as long as blood is exposed to the air, it can pick up some of that yeast, which can then grow from that point on.
That's absolutely correct. There is one particular type of yeast that's found naturally well, I'm sure it's found other places as well, but in a female's vagina. And then it also exists in the air on surfaces of things in an unhygienic environment. That's why our doctors take such precautions to keep everything sanitary. She had, her whole leg was ripped open. She had, part of her ear was severed. I mean, she had all kinds of exposure to any kind of microorganisms, yeast or otherwise, that can cause this fermentation. And the preservative that they put in their gray top tubes, that does not work with the Candidus albicans, which is the yeast that is in the vagina that can cause the fermentation.
It does not.
It does not. It does not preserve against that.
And even there's been question in other cases
Especially
whether or not
elevated glucose.
Okay, whether or not an authority shook the vial enough also to mix up this chemical to protect it.
That's always an issue, and it wasn't as much of an issue in our case because in this case they claim that they shook the vial.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's certainly something that they have to do. They have to do that, and they have to refrigerate it to make sure that everything's getting preserved in there.
Carrie, are you how are you feeling about hearing this information right now? How does it sound to you?
Well, to me, it sounds like, honestly, my first thought through my head when Jennifer walked in, and you brought diagrams and photos that you present as evidence in your trial. Is that correct?
Yes.
My first question I'm thinking is, how is your client today? How is she doing? That's the nurturer, the mother in me.
Yeah.
Because I feel like you did an amazing job representing her, but like you said, there's so many holes in what actually occurred. So I'm thinking, how is she feeling today?
I think that, I mean, that's the hard thing about this case is that this client is the nicest client probably I've ever had. Her parents are wonderful people, and it's so hard. She really legitimately does not remember what happened that night.
And she feels hopeless because of that, I'm sure.
So it's frustrating, and we came so close with this trial. The jury was out over 13 hours over a 2-day period. The court replaced, after 10 hours, a juror that got sick with an alternate. And then they came back with a guilty verdict. But we learned from juror interviews that when we let them go home at 2:30 in the morning that night, they were 10 not guilty, 2 guilty. And somehow that flipped around. So to come so close to ending this nightmare for this family, and then to be now, on an appellate bond, facing an appeal when her parents are taking out, all kinds of mortgages on their home and everything to pay for it, it's quite stressful on them. But she's handling it with resilience, with a positive attitude. She's really seeing the fact that she has life as a gift, and she doesn't let the stress that she's going through affect others negatively. She focuses on being positive to those around her and to enjoying time with her family, creating special moments for them, letting others know they're appreciated, taking the time to help others in need. So she's really, I guess, her initial reaction when she found out that the other person was killed, that she wished God had taken her instead. But as God chose for her to not be the one that was taken, she's trying to make the very best that she can with that situation.
Jennifer Bukowsky, lead defense for Kelli Smith. We're talking about this court case. She was sentenced last week to 5 years in prison. And look, there are going to be people listening right now to us that say, look, she was a kid. She drank too much. She drove down the highway the wrong way, hit somebody head on. He's dead. Give it up. And your job as a defense attorney is to be there for your client.
That's right.
How emotionally wrapped up are you in this one?
This one has been harder than most, I would say, because I could live with the juror's verdict a lot better if I had received a fair trial and they had made that determination after hearing all of my evidence, after being able to tell them from the beginning about the circumstances under which Kelli was found, without having an order from the judge that I can't bring up sexual assault or date rape drugs. If they had been given an instruction in the jury instructions on Missouri law as to involuntary intoxication, or correctly instructed as to blood alcohol evidence. If there had been a fair trial and it had come back this way, I could at least say I did everything I could. This is how the jury ruled. I can respect their decision or live with their decision. But when I know that my client did not receive anything close to a fair trial in this case, it's been a very difficult case for me professionally and personally to deal with.
Would you say it angers you? I mean, that anger and that frustration motivates you even more?
I think so. I mean, for the appeal, game on. Let's, taking it to a higher court, and we'll have more judges that can look at this and decide whether or not the proceedings were fair.
I can't imagine how pissed I would be if you told me that we're not going to allow in this and this and this and this. And it's like, wait a second, this is part of this whole scenario, and you guys are taking it from the moment
right before
that the cars hit together. From that moment forward, hey man, there's a lot of stuff leading up to that, and we want to talk about that. And the judge said inadmissible. Do you hate this judge? I mean, how have you worked? I want this seriously. I mean, have you presented in front of this judge before?
This was the first case I've had before this judge.
Okay, all right, and I'm not trying to make this personal about that specific judge.
Well, they're clearly not going to have coffee anytime soon.
Yeah.
I mean...
That's exactly right. But I think when you are trying to present these pieces and the judge says, and this is why I don't even want, you can bring up the judge's name if you want to, but that's not important to me. The judge believed that they were doing right by the law by not allowing this in. I mean, I have to believe that they didn't get up that morning and go, man, I just can't stand Kelli Smith, so I'm going to find a way to screw her over. I mean, I think they believed they were doing lawfully the proper thing.
I hope that that's what they believed. I certainly do. A lot of times, this happens on both sides of the aisle with defense or prosecution. You don't want to develop what's called bad facts. And the fact that this girl had probably been forcibly sexually assaulted that night is a bad fact for your involuntary manslaughter prosecution. So they don't look into it, because then you're just developing evidence that's going to hurt you later on in your case. And I think that could be a possible explanation for why this wasn't thoroughly investigated and why we have more work to do. And concurrently with the appeal, now that I've had the case and I have more time now, I'd like to pursue actually investigating and finding out what did happen to Kelli Smith that night, starting with getting DNA evidence. We've went and put plastic on the car to seal it because I believe it's a crime scene, that there's hand marks on the ceiling of her vehicle. So we are going to be pursuing all leads to try to solve the riddles of this case.
Let us pause with that, because I want to ask what the next steps are. And it sounds like you're going to go even deeper yet. So I want to find out more about that and chat with you. We still have a little bit of time. Correct?
Correct.
You're not going to run off on us yet? All right. We're at the Broadway. Jennifer Bukowsky defending Kelli Smith. We're going to talk more about this. And I think, Carrie, I'm close to having the phones figured out.
Okay.
So I want to say, if you want to call 573-578-TALK, T-A-L-K, or 8255, and take it from there, we are Tom Bradley Show.
Listening to The Tom Bradley Show on Jack FM and online at thetombradleyshow.com.
And welcome back as we continue our conversation from the Broadway with Jennifer Bukowsky, who is the lead defense for Kelli Smith, was convicted in December of involuntary manslaughter. It was concerning an accident, head-on collision, about 50 miles east of Columbia, and it took the life of Thomas Sullivan. Do I have his name correct? Yes. And he was 35 years old. She was convicted in December last week, the formal sentencing for 5 years in prison. And Jennifer, you brought a lot of materials with you this morning. You really did your homework for today, just to come on the show. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome.
I'm looking over these pieces, and she brought in all the different pictures and charts from the actual court proceedings. And the pictures, obviously a man's life was lost in the accident. But your defense is that there were other things that led up to the accident that were beyond her control. And some of those things include injuries that you believe, the defense believes, she received long before this accident happened.
I don't know how much long before the accident. Probably shortly before the accident, yes. But 4 nurses and a doctor all believed and these are people that see car crash victims every day. Every day they see them. They believe that these injuries were suspicious and not consistent with the car crash, and that they needed to be documented.
This isn't legal, but Carrie, when you saw the pictures of some of those bruises, did they look immediately like it was not from an accident?
Not from an accident. And I'm no medical expert by far, but they looked, you know, they still had that red tint to them, like they were fairly recent, not consistent with the car crash. And I saw the pictures of her vehicle they're not consistent with the car crash.
And it's a horrible.
It is horrible.
And I actually had a pathologist who does autopsies who actually showed, like, this is hand marks pulling her inner thighs apart. And yes, these are bruises on the underside of each wrist, which are defensive wounds from holding a person down. And there's no explanation from a car crash for damage to her cervix, which is all the way at the top, basically, of the vagina.
And there's nothing about the car crash that would have caused that, from everything that you've seen.
No. Unless she had like a miniature hat rack in between her legs as she's driving down the highway. There's nothing from that car crash that could have gone all the way up there and penetrated and caused that trauma to her cervix all the way inside of her vagina.
If there was a date rape drug involved, then my guess would be there wouldn't be this kind of physical altercation that would have caused some of the bruising. I would imagine that she would have been generally incoherent.
That's the thing. That's one of the frustrating things of not being able to really fully inform the jurors about date rape drugs, because there's a category of drugs that are known to facilitate sexual assault, and not all of them make you unable to move. I mean, quite a few of them you can move, and you do move, and you walk out with the bar or wherever with the guy that gave you the drug. Not all of them make you completely, able to lay there and take it, but some of them completely make you lose your memory, so the guy knows that there'll be no consequences.
Wow. And again, what you said earlier, the cotton swab that was taken as evidence, we don't know if there's male DNA involved.
Right.
There
might not be.
There was no semen.
She had been washed. Yeah, there was no spermzoa. They checked for that. But normally, and this was kind of shocking to me, the criminalist from the Highway Patrol admitted normally when there is indication of penetration of the vagina, they check for DNA. And they did not here.
That is very
because
strange.
DNA can come from, skin cells. It can come from fragments of it can come from multiple things besides sperm, zoa, inside of there. And so all that they would have to do is look for the Y chromosome. And then obviously that wouldn't be her. And then you know that you have your suspect.
While we're in the middle of talking about chemistry over here, what is the deal with, we talked earlier about the fermentation of the blood that can happen and may very well have happened to Kelli's blood sample. Why was the blood left unrefrigerated for how long? One source
10 days.
You say 10 days. I saw another source said 59 hours. Why is there...
That's how I believe 59 hours is the number of hours it was in the Highway Patrol trooper's car before he took it to the substation for the F Patrol in Montgomery County, which is just a room at the courthouse. Then it was left unrefrigerated there for the remainder of the 10 days before it's finally brought to Troop F headquarters and put in the refrigerator.
Why would anyone leave blood unrefrigerated?
Under a mistaken belief that the sodium nanofluoride or whatever, the preservative in there, you don't need to refrigerate it.
Does that also keep from it coagulating? Is that...
Yes, that's part of the chemicals in there, prevent the coagulation. But that alone, that sodium fluoride alone, is not enough to prevent fermentation. You need refrigeration too, particularly when there is elevated glucose, as there was with Kelli Smith.
And Carrie, I just want to, are you weirded out to find out that blood was taken and drawn as a sample, and we're talking about an accident where a man lost his life, and that blood was
They
left...
wait 7.5 hours to bother getting it to begin with.
Okay, so that's because you think you'd want that immediately,
right,
as immediate as you can, and then to find out that it was left unrefrigerated for 10 days, does that weird you out?
That really does bother me. The question I have, so there is a substance on the blood vial.
Yes, in the gray top tube, sodium fluoride or nanofluoride. I wish I had it right in front of me because I'm not a scientist, but yes. And so you shake up these tubes, and that activates those ingredients, and it's supposed to help with preservation.
Okay.
And
Until
to
it can be
prevent
refrigerated.
coagulation. Yeah.
Okay.
And then while it's being refrigerated, so that you don't have the decay of the blood, basically, that you would naturally, or also to prevent certain microorganisms from causing the fermentation that can cause a rise in the elevation of the alcohol levels. Now, those chemicals don't combat certain microorganisms, like certain yeasts, like the ones that can be found naturally inside every woman's vagina. Every woman has yeast in there. So those chemicals don't combat that. And here we have an individual who had trauma to that area. So that's how that yeast could have gotten into the blood. That's just one thing. I'm not saying that that's what, I can't prove that that is what happened, but that's one way it could have happened. It could have also been an airborne or a surface-borne thing from an unsanitary environment. She's being life-flighted after being torn open in a car crash. I mean, she could have picked up anything from any of those places.
I'm sorry, Carrie, go ahead.
What was the explanation for the 57 hours and then the 59, excuse me, 59 hours in the patrol car and then the 10 days before refrigerated? What was their explanation for that?
That the Missouri Highway Patrol policies and procedures does not require refrigeration. But actually, I had an expert from law enforcement testify that it is for probably, I forget what percent, 90% of the law enforcement agencies in the state does require refrigeration. And their own manual that they give to all the troopers, that I asked the trooper, do you have this manual? He said he did. It says in there, like, no less than 3 times to refrigerate the samples. That's how important it is. It says over and over again to refrigerate them.
So what they are trained on, what they keep in their...
It might not be adopted in their formal policy manual, but the thing that their own Highway Patrol lab gives to all the troopers on preserving evidence says in there 3 different times refrigerate the blood. Because in their own toxicology policies and procedures, it says it's well documented that not refrigerating these things can lead to this fermentation.
Or even if it went the other way. What if not refrigerating would cause you to lose some of that alcohol content? And so it's not just that it's left sitting out for a week and a half, all right? And you know how pro law enforcement I am. You and I off the air have talked about that. You have said, Jennifer, Tom, I would never put you on a jury if I was presenting the case because you're so pro law enforcement. But I sit here looking at this and I'm like...
I would almost consider you for this particular jury because you are pro good law enforcement.
And there you go. And immediately I'm upset that this thing is going on like this. But here's, not only is it left unrefrigerated, why does it take us a week and a half to find out if she has alcohol in her blood?
Oh, it took longer than that.
This doesn't make any sense. I mean, how long until you get a BAC from a breathalyzer?
Seconds.
I mean,
well, she's unconscious, so she can't.
Well, no, I understand that, but we're taking the blood, and why isn't that immediately? Let's just say that nothing bad can happen to the blood. Let's just imagine that. Why isn't it immediately sent to a lab? You know, we've got somebody that's out driving the wrong way on the highway. We think she's intoxicated. I want that now.
Well, the accident occurred on the 25th of February, and it was a leap year. The lab received the blood on March 6th, and then they do the testing starting on March 12th and completing it on March 16th. The other thing they did...
we talk about that they got that much of a backlog that it has to... I can't get you in the garage till a week from Saturday.
I don't know. You'd have to ask them. I'm not sure why it took so long. They were asked to do date rape drug testing, and they destroyed almost all the drugs in doing it, and they did it the wrong way by looking at... Like, it'd be like if you're looking for forests. They were, like, looking for forests when they needed to be looking for trees and looking for specific trees among forests. They looked for really big quantities of drugs when really the kinds of drugs that they should have been looking for, they should have tailored their test to look for very small, minute traces of these date rape drugs that would have still been in her system at that time if they hadn't cleared it and not running it at such... Am I explaining that very well?
Yeah. She did drink that night, and she could have registered.
Funny. There's no evidence at trial, almost none, that she was drinking that night.
Well, because you have some of her friends who did claim that she was drinking, but they were not allowed to testify. Is that correct?
No, that's not exactly correct. They were there to testify. They all say that she wasn't drunk. All of the guys say that she didn't appear drunk. They didn't really put any alcohol in her hand.
Okay.
But there's a discovery violation that the state came out with at trial that we allege is a discovery violation. Some Facebook page of my client that they just surprised us with when they're required to disclose those sorts of things. And because of that and the way they were asking the one friend we did call questions about reading that Facebook out loud, we made the determination that we could not call the witnesses. So we promised an opening because we didn't know what further damage from surprises that were discovery violations might occur. But to preserve that issue for appeal, we have the affidavits from the friends as to what they would say, but they say she was not drunk.
So give me 3 of the key main points that you want, and we only have a couple minutes, and I know you got to get going. You're listening to Jack FM and the TomBradleyShow.com, and Jennifer Bukowsky is lead defense for Kelli Smith. This appeal you're going to file, give me like 3 main points of the biggest pieces that you want to see them either you want to go back to trial, I guess is what you're asking for. Appeal the decision.
Yes, and get a new trial to get a fair jury, because we had jurors improperly seated that could not be fair and unbiased because I was not allowed to ask questions about sexual assault or date rape drugs, so they brought in their own personal experiences they didn't set aside. I didn't get to call them in. I didn't get to talk about those things in opening. And then another big thing was I didn't get the instructions on the law for involuntary intoxication. And finally, my expert it was his opinion that she was under the influence of a date rape drug. The judge kept that out and kept out all discussion as to explaining what date rape drugs are, what the effects of them could be, and very much limited my neuropsychologist's testimony as to this could not be alcohol alone accounting for her behavior that night. So it just took the legs out from under the defense. And so those would be the main things that I hope the appellate court will order in a new trial, that we do get to present to the jury so that she could have a fair trial and we can have more confidence in the integrity of the verdict.
Obviously, I and everyone else, we want the truth to come through on something like this, and we want the right things to happen. I can't go on without reminding ourselves that, this guy lost his life.
And now, it's tragic. Very tragic.
It's right. That's its own thing. And all he was doing was driving on the highway at 3:30 or so in the morning. And so he leaves behind a family. That's really, really horrible. But if the ensuing, prosecution of anyone winds up with something less than the truth and the full truth on this thing, then we just wind up making a horrible situation even worse.
And if someone did drug and rape her, you're letting a felony murderer get away with it, essentially, because that person committed a felony that led to the death of another.
Who is here in Columbia.
And could do it again to another beautiful 22-year-old girl.
Jennifer Bukowsky, thank you very much for coming in. I really appreciate that, and I'm sure that it's not the last time we're going to have you on the show to talk about this case. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Appreciate it.